Hello, everybody. It has been a very long time since I've told a scary story. I've told two so far, and I've gotten some permission from this person from Reddit to tell a story that they have posted, which I will link their story in the description. Their user is mother-effective-797. Let's get this started. I watched my grandfather's farm while he was in the hospital and had to feed the well.
Growing up, I spent a lot of time on my grandfather's farm. He raised corn, mostly, but also had a few cows and sheep he raised there as well. We'd head up there every month or two to visit him. He'd take us fishing, riding on the tractor, and let us feed the animals. He only ever had one rule. When my brother and I would visit, don't go near the old well. When I was younger, I didn't think much about it. It was dilapidated, old, well, and I figured he didn't want to risk a couple of kids falling down it and getting trapped, hurt, or killed. It made perfect sense in that context, and that was the end of it, or at least it was until he had a stroke. I was 30 at the time. I hadn't seen my grandfather in years. It wasn't because I didn't want to. I was simply too busy with my life's demands and hadn't made time for it. That's why it hit my heart so hard when I heard of the stroke he had. I made the long trip to the hospital to visit him. My mother and father already there. My younger brother was out of the state at the time, which was pretty normal for him. He was in some kind of corporate management and did a lot of traveling. As a result, I never bothered to learn the details of his career. Probably because I was more than a little jealous anyways. That was why Daniel wasn't there that night. I walked through the hospital, my nose wrinkling at the abrasive smell of disinfectants they used to sterilize every inch of the building, each open door lining the hallways with glimpses into private tragedy of some kind. Through one doorway was a man on a ventilator, through another was a woman being fed by a nurse while staring into nothingness. I have never liked hospitals, but on the day I went to visit Grandpa Silas after his stroke, I was keenly aware that my life may end in a place like this, that one day some young man may walk past my open door and glimpse my own private tragedy. My grandfather's room was towards the end of the hall. As I approached, I started to knock, but realized he may not be able to speak, so I just gently cracked the door open a little. "Hello, Grandpa? It's me, Chester," I said before opening it fully. The old man was laying in a bed facing the door, half his face lighting up as I walked in, the other half drooping with paralysis. "Chester, you came to visit me. You have no idea how relieved I am to see you," he told me through the half of his mouth that could move. I walked in and took the seat next to his bed, then reached out to hold his hand. "Of course I came to see you. What kind of grandson would I be if I didn't?" "Listen, Chester, I'm going to be alright, but I need you to do something for me. There's no one to watch the farm right now. I'll be here a few weeks, but in the meantime, you need to do that for me," he said, each word strained and enunciated with effort. I had planned to watch the farm for him. My mother had told me to expect that request since I was the only one in the family that could. I was the only one that had no pets, no significant other, and was in the state at the moment. Fortunately, I had saved up my vacation days at my job. Not that they would have any problem giving me time off. I worked in a warehouse that did all kinds of shipping, and after one of the forklift drivers took his own life, a nasty rumor had spread that it was because he had been overworked, so they were pretty much ready to give anyone whatever they wanted at the moment. That was a strange situation, one that could be another story entirely separate from this one, but it isn't important here. I already talked to Mom and cleared my schedule. "I'll look after the farm, Grandpa." Not just the farm, Chester. I need you to look after the well, he whispered suddenly, looking scared. The well? You mean the old thing you told Daniel and me to stay away from when we were kids? I responded in a confused tone. Yeah, that. Well, I knew someone would have to take my place one day. It's just coming sooner than I thought. I wondered if the stroke was making him talk nonsense, but he seemed lucid enough as he explained. When I was a kid, my daddy owned that farm. It didn't grow much of nothing back then. This was in the middle of the Depression when the Dust Bowl was wiping out all the farmland. I remember how we were always hungry. Someday you'll learn that when the kids are always hungry, the adults are practically dying. Anyways, one day the farm started producing, not just producing, but overproducing. I didn't know what had changed back then, but anything we planted there seemed to grow fast and strong. When my daddy was on his deathbed, I found out it was the well. As long as we fed the well, the land would feed us. Grandpa, this sounds crazy. It's kind of crazy, I said, politely as I could. Listen, boy, you might think I'm just a half-witted old man, but I'm telling you that well isn't a well, it's a mouth that's gotta be fed. I need you to feed it while I'm recovering. Promise me, boy, you promise me, he exclaimed with a sudden force. I promise, Grandpa. I just don't understand, though. What do you mean when you say feed the well? I mean you need to throw meat down there. If you look under my bed at the farmhouse, you'll find instructions in an old book, the same book my daddy left me when he passed. You gotta follow those directions to the letter. I've been doing it for 60 some odd years now. You can do it for a few weeks. Just promise me, boy, promise you'll do it, Chester. I promise, I said again, my words seeming to make the old man relax. He let go of my arm, and that I hadn't even realized he had been gripping, and laid back down. I wasn't sure if I'd keep this promise, but there was no harm in telling him I would. So that's how I ended up on my grandfather's farm, in the country, surrounded by corn and sky. There wasn't any cell towers out there, so I had no internet and no phone, except on the rare occasion I would make the hour-long drive into a nearest town for a single bar of signal. I felt totally removed from the world, as if I had stepped through a portal into a different dimension entirely. I was from the city, with its constant lights and sounds of traffic, that I had grown so used to the absence of its presence was disturbing to me. My first day there, I drove up the long driveway to the farmhouse and got my first good look at the place since I had been a child. My first impression is that it had been frozen in time, looking the exact same as it had in 2 decades. Since last I had seen it, just an old farmhouse, a brown wood, a chimney rising on the end of the roof, and the old porch I had played on in my childhood. A warm sense of nostalgia watched over me. Eliza tying a smile from me with just a glance. The old barn was still standing a short distance from the house. The same little trail leading to the pond we had gone fishing at was still there. The mysterious well with its rough circle of brisk still jutted up in the distance. I couldn't help but myself. I walked over to the well to take a closer look. It was smaller than I remember, but I had only ever seen it from a distance back then. I looked down it and saw nothing but the dark pit that I was expecting to see. I picked up one of the loose stones from the ring that surrounded the top of it and tossed one down. There, absent-mindedly, I listened for a thunk or a splash to alert me up to the depth of it, but there was nothing, just silence. I didn't think much of it though. Just shrugged and walked inside the house. It was exactly as my grandmother had kept it before she passed. I figured either Grandpa Silas kept it that way out of respect for her memory, or the more likely of the reason she had laid down the law so effectively that he wouldn't violate it even after her passing. He had a way she wanted the house to look, and took extreme pride in it. She was a woman of great fortitude, and my whole family misses her every day. The house was neat and clean, not even dishes in the sink or unwashed window. I crept up the stairs into the bedroom to the left. Under was an old leather-bound book, the pages of which were full of handwritten notes. I flipped through them and found most of them were on farming techniques. Little notes about crop rotation and when to let which field lie to follow for the year. Towards the end of the page, bearing a pencil sketch of the well, my great-grandfather was quite the artist, capturing the fallen and broken stones in perfect likeness of it. The next page had notes on it. The well is why the land is good here. Feed the well and it will feed us. Usually 20 pounds of beef or lamb seems to keep it satiated. Sometimes it will get riled up and demand 30 or 40 pounds, but that's rare. During the harvest moon, it needs human meat. We got ourselves a deal in town with the local corner. Once a year, he'll misplace a body to go into the well. It's a ghastly ordeal, but we only needed to do it once a year. It's not just about the harvest, Silas. It's about the well. It's itself. Before you were born, when we first got the farm, we dug that well. It was violent back then, but we reached an understanding. As long as we perform our duties and will stay peaceful, content to be fed instead of hunting, you'll know if it needs more meat when it howls. Don't let it wait too long. If it calls, it will get hungry and start hunting. Needless to say, I was curious. I looked through some more pages to see if there was anything else written about it and found nothing. I hadn't really believed my grandfather. I didn't even expect to find a book under his bed, let alone the written instructions he was referring to. My first thought was that the whole thing was an elaborate superstition or something, but decided I would do as I was asked. So I went to the cellar, found a refrigerator full of meat, and pulled out 20 pounds worth. I walked out to the well and shrugged, then tossed it down. After throwing a hunk of beef into the hole, I listened for it to hit either hard ground or water and heard nothing. After a while, I realized I was holding my breath and let it out. As I did, I heard a wet crunch come from the well. It made me jump back from it, startled. Immediately felt sick, as if I was standing next to some gaping mouth instead of an old hole in the ground, and walked quickly back towards the house. I was still curious, sure, but I was so unnerved by the whole interaction that I was content to just forget about it as quickly as possible. I spent the rest of my day trying to entertain myself. I called my mom and talked to her on the old landline affixed to the wall of the home. She said Grandpa was still recovering, but to just keep keeping the farm running in the meantime. I didn't tell her about the well, fearing I'd sound crazy after all. I had decided I imagined the whole thing at this point. I got off the phone and went looking through the bookshelf in the living room. I eventually decided on a worn copy of the Count of Monte Cristo and spent the rest of the afternoon reading. I must have fallen asleep reading, because I woke up in the same leather armchair I had settled into with the book sitting open in my lap. I had made it to the part where Edmond Dantes was escaping the prison, apparently. I stood up and stretched, trying to relax my muscles, and walked outside. I had forgotten to feed the cows and the sheep yesterday. They were vocalizing as I walked up to them. They had been stuck in the barn all night while I had remembered to uselessly feed the hole in the ground. I felt more than a little guilty as I poured feed into the troughs. I finished up and began walking back to the house, pausing to look at the well as I did so. I shook my head in disbelief when I remembered how convinced by all the nonsense I decided I wouldn't be wasting any more time on this stupid well nonsense. I went back inside to continue reading and eat lunch. I sat there, engrossed in the tale of Edmond Dantes, finding the Isle of Monte Cristo, when I heard a loud shrieking sound coming from outside. Around 3 in the afternoon, I ran outside thinking someone had been injured and began looking around frantically. There was nothing, just a breeze whispering. its way through the endless sea of corn and trees around me. I was about to head back inside when I heard it again, a piercing howl coming from the well. I felt a chill run through me and ran to the cellar, grabbing a hunk of lamb from the refrigerator and ran to throw it down the well. I watched it tumble into the darkness and quickly disappear, only to hear the same loud, wet crunch like someone had bitten into an apple. I stood there in disbelief, feeling horrified. If my grandfather and great-grandfather had been insane, then I surely was too, because I believed all of it in that moment. Any sense of doubt was driven out by the worrying thought of whatever was in that well coming out to hunt or whatever. The next few days continued uneventfully. Every day around noon, I'd toss a hunk of cold meat into the yawning mouth of the well. On the fourth day of my stay, I found a lantern in the closet of my grandfather's bedroom and got an idea. Using an old rope I had found in the barn, I tied the lantern on the tight and went out to the well around feeding time. I lowered the lantern in watching as the walls changed from stone to hardened dirt in the yellow glow. I kept lowering it as it became a distant yellow dot in the black of the well. I kept lowering it even after the dot vanished into the depths and I could see nothing of it. I was running low on rope when it inexplicably found a bottom. I dropped the hunk of flesh I was holding in my free hand and watched it tumble after the lantern. After a couple of seconds, the bottom of the lantern was resting against, gave way, and the rope tightened like something was pulling against it. Then I was falling back as it went slack, the weight of even the lantern vanishing. I hit the ground just as I heard a wet crunching sound. I reeled in the rope while I was laying there trying to make sense of what just happened. I reached the end and looked at where the lantern should have been. The fiber splayed as if something had been through it. I got to my feet and dusted myself off, glancing nervously at the hole. With its circle of crumbling masonry, I was so shocked I couldn't will my body into action, instead continuing to stare in fixed confusion and horror. After a few seconds of this, I heard a bubbling sound come from the well. I cautiously glanced over the side to peer into it, then had to jerk my head back to dodge a flying piece of shrapnel rocketing up from its depths. I watched the blur zoom past my head and fly into the air, falling in a parabolic arc to land by my feet. It was the lantern, or what was left of it. It had been crushed in the middle, the metal bent inwards around and the mostly broken glass of the center. I picked it up, considering it was incredulity like my own eyes were deceiving me. I didn't throw it away, instead keeping it on the porch to look at every time I began to doubt any of this was real. Over the next couple of days, I began to glance anxiously at the old paper calendar hanging in my grandfather's kitchen. There was a big red circle with the words Harvest Moon in the center. It was only a week away. I called my mother again and asked about Grandpa Silas, wondering how long before he'd return to the farm. She told me there was no way to be sure that he was still recovering. Okay, it's just that I can't afford to miss too much work, I told her. Don't worry, honey. It'll probably be another week or so. The whole family really appreciates you doing this, she said. Have you been doing everything you're supposed to be doing? Of course, Mom. I've been keeping on top of all of it. Just make sure you feed the well, she added. What? I asked, feeling a sudden coldness shoot through me. Just make sure you're feeding the well, she reiterated. You sound stressed and you know how I worry. Make sure you're eating enough. I will, Mom. I love you. I got to go. Finished and hung up. All of this was starting to get to me. Hopefully Grandpa would be back soon and could do my best to convince myself there was some rational explanation for all of this. That's when the well began to howl. I already fed it today, but it was apparently still hungry, so I went out and went through the ritual of taking meat from the cellar and throwing it down the well. I went back inside and sat down to read the Count of Monte Cristo and tried not to think of the harvest moon drawing ever near. The days passed while I grew more agitated, hoping I'd get a phone call letting me know that Grandpa was headed back to the farm, releasing me of my solitary confinement and letting me escape this château d'œuf. Found myself in when the phone finally did ring the day before the harvest moon. I answered it excitedly, hoping to my mother or even my grandfather let me know that I was free to leave this place. "Hello," I said into the receiver, unable to stop myself from smiling. "Hello, Chester. This is Evan Parker, the coroner here in town. Your grandfather left instructions to call you and arrange for your pickup." I felt sick immediately knowing what he was referring to. "Oh," was all I could think to say. "Listen, son, I know this is probably awful strange for you, but for us this is just that time of year again. It's unsavory business to be sure, but it'll be okay. We do this every year. You'll feed the well as usual tomorrow, but come to my office after. When the harvest moon is overhead, that's when you give it a sacrifice." "Sacrifice?" I said in shock. "We just call it that. Just be happy we have a body this year." "That isn't always the case," he replied honestly. "What happens when you don't have a body?" I asked. "Better you don't worry about that. Just be here tomorrow, understood?" I just whispered, "Okay." The next day I fed the well and ventured into town. I drove my grandfather's beat-up pickup truck, an old Chevy that looked like it had to be older than me. I pulled up to the coroner's office and met Evan at the door. He was a little younger than my grandfather, his white hair neatly combed back, and the glasses with thick black frames perched on his nose. "Okay, it's the box here by the door," he immediately says with no primo. "Give me a hand carrying it out and we'll lay it down in the back." "I'm sorry, I have so many questions," I blurted even as I grabbed one end of the rectangular wooden box. "What is this well? What happens if I don't feed it?" "Son," Evan grunted while helping me walk the box to my waiting car, "you don't need to worry about all that. All you need to do is follow the instructions. Just know that if you don't feed that thing, all hell will break loose." We secured the box and closed the door. Evan turning back towards the office to walk away before I could ask any more questions. I yelled after him anyways. "I deserve to know. You guys got me doing all this. I deserve to know why," I called to him. He stopped and turned towards me, looking unsure as he slowly walked back towards me. "We feed the well. It feeds us. It's that simple, Chester," he whispered, looking a little scared. "And if we don't feed it, it'll feed on us. What we do now is the best way to handle it. We've done it like this for over a century for a reason." "Okay, but what the hell is down there? Do we know?" "Son, you don't understand. The only thing down there is teeth and a stomach. We gotta keep full. You look out there at it and you just see the tip of the iceberg. You're seeing the lure of an anglerfish that's all pray to God that you never see the rest of it." He walked away before I could ask any more questions, not that I could think of any. I got in the truck and began heading back to the farm, trying not to look at the box in the back seat, trying to think about what was in it, trying not to think about how I was going to have to open it that night. I was so engrossed in trying to get back to the farm and get away from the box that I hadn't realized I was speeding. Red and blue lights lit up behind me and my eyes widened in fear. I pulled off to the side of the road and tried to think of some kind of excuse. The police officer stepped out and walked up to my open window. He shined a light into the car without speaking and looked at the box in the back, then focused the light on me. "Silas is your granddad," he said, not a hint of question in his statement. Yeah, I'm Chester," I said nervously. "Slow it down a little, Chester. You got plenty of time, no need to speed." With that, he walked back to his car and pulled away. I gulped hard, feeling cold sweat beating at my brow. I just wanted this to be over already. I pulled into the driveway of the farmhouse, parked the truck, and pulled the box from the back. It was heavy, but I managed to drag it next to the well. I was tempted to get the gruesome act over with, but remembered the coroner's warning to wait until the moon was overhead. So I walked back to the house and sat on the porch staring into space. I don't know how long I sat there, but I watched as the sky dimmed with orange hues of the setting sun. I heard the phone ring from inside the house. Finally roused myself, I grabbed the phone and put it in my ears, hearing a voice speak. Before I had any time to say anything, Chester came the voice of Grandpa Silas. "I'm sorry you're having to do this, but there shouldn't be anything to worry about, okay?" "Grandpa, what's going on?" I said shakily, filling my eyes brim with tears. "I'm sorry, Chess. You got thrown into this out of nowhere. I know I need you to do this, though. You got to. Can you just tell me what it is? I need to know what it is." There was a pregnant silence that hung in the air for a few seconds before he started to speak. "I'm not even really sure what it is. The well is a mouth. We know that. The rest of it is under the ground. It's lived there for a long time. Long before we built the farm, it used to hunt there. You see, my father told me that it would hide in the ground waiting for someone to walk over it, then burst out like a trapdoor spider. It sounds like a monster, but it isn't one, not any more than we are for raising cattle or hunting deer. My father worked out his arrangement with it and built the well to keep it fed. In return for feeding it, it helps the crops grow and feeds us. The only caveat was that once a year during the harvest moon, we'd have to give it human meat. Usually there would be a body in the morgue to use, but sometimes we had to make tougher calls. If there wasn't a body, we'd go to the jail and find the worst person we could to throw them in. A couple of very rare times we took more drastic measures. You don't need to worry about any of that, though. You just have to feed it tonight. I'll be home tomorrow. Then you can forget about all of this and go back to your normal life." "How can I forget about any of this?" I asked, receiving no answer. "Just get this done, Chester. I'll be back tomorrow morning." I got off the phone and looked outside, looking at the moon starting to slide over the sky. I walked out to the porch and sat back down, watching the moon shone bright and brilliant over the fields of the corn. I knew I couldn't put it off any longer, and walked down to the well. It didn't take long to pry off the lid of the wooden box. Inside was a woman's body curled up in a fetal position so it would fit inside its pitiful excuse for a casket. I placed my hand under the arm of the body and lifted out the stiff and cold corpse. I sat her on the stony lip of the well and looked down the hole, trying not to imagine the teeth waiting near the bottom. I pushed the body over the side and watched it vanish. I expected the familiar wet crunch, but I didn't expect what was for it to be repeated again and again. I realized with shock and terror that whatever was down there was chewing. I went back inside and sat down in the living room. I sat there staring out the window in the direction of the well and didn't sleep that night. I barely blinked. My only grace was knowing my grandfather would be back in the morning. Only he wasn't. As the day dragged on, I got increasingly worried until late in the afternoon when the phone rang. It was my mom. "Chester, I have some bad news." "What is it, Mom?" I asked, feeling my heart begin to pound hard in my chest. "It's your grandfather. He was heading back from the hospital." She started crying and was having trouble finishing the sentence. "What happened, Mom?" I whispered, feeling all the hope drain away. "Your grandfather was riding home from the hospital when he got in a car wreck. He didn't make it." I could hardly breathe, feeling my eyes begin watering, and the desperation as what she was saying dawned on me. "We're coming down there to prepare for the funeral. You just need to look over the farm for a while. I'm sorry." I didn't respond to her for a while. Finally, I told her all was well and that I loved her. I would have liked to have stayed on the phone for a bit longer, but I had to go. The well was hot.